You may take a break. Not us. We never take a break. We're always on. PPRNradio.net. Music 24/7.
Hey, good evening, everyone out there. It's Monday at 8:30, and this is Dr. Mark Bono for your next open source recovery radio session. And I'm having an interesting day. I was had the honor of presenting at a conference today, and I also have the honor of presenting you with another guest who is just another in a string of inspiring people who have decided to do something about drug, alcohol, and mental health issues, and have started yet another nonprofit organization, as I like to call it, a grassroots kind of movement. We have so much of that happening here in Connecticut, and I was unaware of this myself until recently, and we were able to help someone that this gentleman referred to our program, and so we were able to find out more about what he does. So we have Dennis Cole with us. I will say. Dennis, just thanks for coming on and sharing what you're about to share with us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So Dennis has started a nonprofit agency called Uniformed Services Peer Council. And there is this hidden problem that a lot of people are not aware of amongst our first responders, people in uniform, EMTs, police, etc., as well as veterans. And Dennis has himself works in that field and is a first responder. And he has taken the initiative to start something that could be really important to a lot of people in Connecticut who are trying to deal with addiction and or mental health issues and are in the field of being a first responder or a veteran. And there's some special needs that these folks have, correct, Dennis?
Very much so, yes.
I was just reading some of your material before, and some things that were sort of made common sense to me as I was reading them about what kind of additional vulnerabilities first responders have to developing problems with substances or mental illness. Do you want to maybe elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, there's a not so good secret in the industry that we tend to drown ourselves in alcohol, among other things, to deal with the issues with trauma. A big thing we see is problems with sleep, and with problems with sleep, it makes everything else worse, and it becomes a vicious cycle. It's also not that big of a secret that us first responders tend to be a little bit hard-headed or thick with taking care of ourselves because we're trained very specifically to take care of everybody else first.
Right.
So our wellness tends to take a back seat to everybody else.
Yeah, I've heard that therapists and psychiatrists also have pretty high suicide rates too, and I think
dentists actually have the highest rate.
Yeah, well, listen, dentists. No, but seriously, that I think that's right. We're trained in different ways to put our needs behind us.
Absolutely, yes.
And
it very much plays to the way that we operate too. No matter what the situation is, most of the time when we see people, it's usually the worst day of their lives.
Right.
And we have to, put the game face on and put back any emotions to deal with the situation.
That's right. And that's a big thing. We just started to tap into that conversation a few minutes ago, and I think that's a really huge factor, I would imagine. I'm not a first responder, but I would imagine.
You subconsciously learn to ignore your emotions.
Right. And try and not process trauma. Just it's supposed to be par for the course, right?
Yep. File it away and move on.
Right.
And
right.
unfortunately, it catches up with you at some point.
That's right. And I had a client not too long ago tell me that their history of trauma, both as a child and then in their work, they try to deal with it by compartmentalizing it, but that they run out of places to store it.
Yeah, just like a bookshelf.
Right.
You can put as many books on there as you want, but eventually they're going to start falling off.
Yeah. And maybe that's why, as you said, there's a sudden and sort of you described it like a sentinel event that occurs, and it's just one too many books,
Yeah, usually it ends up law enforcement involvement or some sort of admission to the hospital.
Right.
That's usually when it hammers home that there's a problem they can't deal with by themselves anymore.
And most of our guests who've been on who have created their own nonprofit and who've gone out there and tried to help those people that they most wanted to reach out to, did so because themselves or a family member had been impacted by a problem. So I know we had spoke briefly before the show, and I know that that's some of your motivation for doing this.
Yeah, very much so. I had my own personal hell that I lived through. I've been doing this now for 16 years total, and I ended up getting mixed up in the alcohol and ignoring and not realizing some of the things that were going on with me. One of the biggest things that started was the nightmares, and to cope with that, the only way that I had ever learned how to do that and what was acceptable in the industry was through alcohol. And that cycle just kind of repeated itself. Unfortunately, it almost ended in 2 suicide attempts for me, the second one being almost successful. And it was at that point that I really realized that there was a problem with the way that we as an industry were dealing with things. I remember very specifically after episode number 2, as I prefer to call it, being inpatient and being with the social workers, and they were saying, we really don't know what to do with you. We don't know what's best right now. We don't think that we could really offer you what you need. So I remember sitting in that office for several hours, doing Google searches, trying to figure out what would be best.
Right.
So I'm sitting with 2 very well-intentioned social workers on Google, trying to figure out what the next best step for me is.
Yeah.
And that was the initial cue that there has to be a better way to do this.
Yeah, I would think. I would hope.
Well, unfortunately, there wasn't.
Right.
So
right.
that was my initiative to create that. And we've done pretty well in the last 2 years.
Yeah, so your organization is about 2 years old.
Yep.
And I'm interested in the format in which your organization works. I find it very interesting. The name of your organization is a peer council, right?
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about how you what you mean by peer council?
By peer council, we network peers. People from different branches of public service, fire, EMS, various law enforcement, and some of our veterans. These people are the type who have been there, done that, and they have expressed their interest in wanting to help and guide others, but didn't really have an outlet to do so. So we put these people together, so when a person reaches out, we are able to pair them with somebody who has the very similar or the same type of background, and we can initiate that one-on-one or more support to help them through the process. The second part of the network is through different providers, therapists, providers, institutions, the whole works. We go through and we find people with the correct backgrounds who are interested in the work that we're doing and are committed to helping these people. So we can do 2 things at once. We can get them to somebody who has been through that situation and can give that one-on-one guidance, and we can also network them to effective care.
Right. And that networking to effective care is is a huge piece of it. Obviously, in addition to having that social support and that connection to someone that you feel safe and open to talking with, but the system of care can be so fragmented.
Very, very much so, yes.
And I have lots of stories myself in terms of being an outpatient treatment provider and winding up trying to help some of my clients get some other kind of services they need, and watching them stumble. I could tell you, just ridiculous stories of alcohol detox. I'll tell you.
Only imagine.
Yeah, actually, I'll tell you one because it's so representative of the problem. So, and I'm sure that you have similar stories from either amongst yourself, in your efforts, or to help yourself, from certainly some of the first responders you tried to help. So I had a client was being seen at my practice for opiate addiction, and she, despite a lot of issues, she stayed off of opiates, but she began drinking alcohol, and it got to the point where she was physically dependent on alcohol, and so she needed to go into detox. So I tried to help her, making calls with her from the office, to get her into a detox, and she finally lands in a detox, and she goes there, and she calls me just several days later, and she's out of the detox, and obviously something went wrong because it was only about 3 days or so. And she tells me that they were detoxing her from alcohol, but they would not let her take her Suboxone medication.
Sorry, I can't make it. It's just my eczema again.
That was not part of the story.
Not your eczema, right?
She was going into withdrawal from opiates because, Suboxone, you have to take that or you become physically ill. And so they were just sitting there letting her go into withdrawal. And I was just mystified that they would, how is someone supposed to get through alcohol withdrawal and then be sitting there languishing in opiate withdrawal, right?
You mean you have to treat dual diagnosis?
Yeah. Well, this was just two forms of addiction, but it's like, you're in a detox. Like, how is this not happening?
You have to deal with them both.
Yeah. And so then we try to get her into another place, and so she finally gets into another place, and when she arrives, her blood alcohol level is so high that they find it to be potentially like life-threatening, so they won't take her there. They send her to an emergency room, right? But what they don't do is they don't set it up for her to come back. So, she goes to the emergency room. They let her stay there until her BAC drops, and then she's back out on the street again. And then she's drinking. So it's just...
Sad but true. It's pretty common, and I don't think a lot of people will understand that.
Right. There was a gentleman who was... I was presenting, as I said, at a conference today about treating opiate addiction, and I had a couple of my clients who volunteered to be sort of our peer expert panel, who could talk firsthand about their experience in trying to get in recovery from opiates. And one of the... gentleman talked about, being in this horrible situation where he was on methadone and he wanted to get off methadone. They wouldn't taper him down until he finally got an attorney. And so they tapered him down from 120 milligrams of methadone down to 0 in a month, which is... It should take at least 6 months for that to happen.
I was gonna say, that seems like a lot, and I don't know too much about methadone. But
trust me, he was hurt. He was hurting, right? So
I would imagine so.
Yeah, out of desperation, he went to detox. But they wouldn't take him because they won't detox you off methadone in a detox program in Connecticut. So he wound up having to go out and shoot heroin in order to get into the detox. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that you hear about, and it's just...
It's wild, and people often think, we have all these places that are here to help, and look at all these people here. They just don't seem like they want it.
You really got to thread the needle to get into
It's far more difficult than it should be.
Yeah.
I mean, all that does is dissuade the people who really, truly do want to recover and live well again. It just kills off their hope. You know, what do you do when you're at that point? You know, I'm standing in front of a detox center or a treatment center, and I want to be able to be well again, and I can't get in because of some simple caveat.
Right.
You know, it's sad.
It is, and I think that's what a lot of the politicians and the administrators of state-run programs, etc. They don't really understand how difficult Connecticut is in terms of really working your way through the system. If you just have to be lucky or have someone that's really, really knowledgeable, but there's this, in California where I used to work, they had this policy that they were actively developing when I was there, called a no wrong door policy. So wherever you came into the system, it didn't matter. That system was geared to get you to the place you needed to be and escort you to the place you needed to be. Sort of like when you're at a high-end supermarket and you ask where the bread is, they walk you over to where the bread is. And they did that because they recognized how fragmented the system was, and they're trying to do something about that.
Yeah, and that's good. I mean, when I had my first event and I started engaging in things, I went and saw a psychiatrist and a general therapist. He was doing the naltrexone for the drinking, and started doing on some meds and things like that.
Yeah.
But as things progressed, unfortunately, I found out that most of what was going on for that first phase, it was not only a lot of trial and error, but there was some guesswork, and nothing was really laid out very well. So I was basically going through the motions. I was doing, I was engaging in AA, and I was taking the meds, and I was seeing the therapist, and going through all of that. And everybody was so interested in dealing with the drinking,
Right.
That they basically sidelined everything else. Say, well, if you get sober, everything else will be fine. And that's not true.
Well,
it didn't work.
Were they aware that besides drinking, that you had been hospitalized for a suicide attempt? I mean,
Oh yes,
Yeah.
very much so. Yeah.
It reminds me of a client in a program that I ran back in California who went to inpatient psychiatric hospitalization after a suicide attempt, and she was intoxicated because she was also alcohol dependent. So she was heavily intoxicated on alcohol, and the diagnosis that she got was substance-induced mood disorder, and on the discharge paperwork, on the treatment recommendations, it said, quote, "get sober."
Mine was alcoholism, not otherwise specified.
Yeah, so, the presenting issue of addiction or substance use doesn't mean that there isn't another underlying issue. And a suicide attempt is probably a hint that there is more than just a substance abuse problem.
I mean, looking back on it, yes, I would think it certainly should be. And, I have to be honest, sometimes I do get a little bit upset about it, because I had entrusted that the people that I was seeing the first time around knew what was best and were putting me down the correct road. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way, which is part of the reason why when we put people into our network, we make sure that they understand what's going on, and they also understand that there's usually another problem besides what you see on the outside, like the substance abuse.
So the way I like to conceptualize substance abuse is, and I didn't make this up, but I adhere to it, is it's a maladaptive coping mechanism.
Absolutely.
And so the issue is what is the person attempting to cope with?
And that's basically what put me down some of the road that I did. And the alcohol was the key for regulating my sleep and drowning out the nightmares, among other things. And the most dangerous thing about it is that it worked, at least for a little while. So it gave me what I wanted, and that's what's scary about it, is because you see it as effective, even though it's killing you.
Well, as you're aware, I've been doing addiction treatment for over 20 years. I've treated pretty much all kinds of addiction, but over the last 7 years, I've been focusing more exclusively on opiates because of the opiate epidemic.
Yep.
But what you just said about, the substance providing short-term relief and being effective, that's one of the reasons opiates are such a big problem, is that, opiates, unfortunately, are very effective at minimizing anxiety and depression and physical fatigue and so many other things that the short-term benefits are hard to look past.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I would think, trauma for sure is, opiates is particularly adept at, blocking out trauma. And then, a lot of times in our program, we have clients who were using opiates and suppressing trauma for a long time, and now they've switched over to Suboxone, which doesn't give them that effect, and they're basically, their emotions.
The door's open now.
Boil back to the surface, yeah. When many years ago, I worked at the Betty Ford Center, and we had a lot of these kind of CEO kind of guys, and they were many of them heavy drinkers, and they would retire and then become, alcoholic, or maybe they were sort of quote unquote functioning alcoholics during their work tenure. But either way, when they finally realized that they couldn't go on that way, or where their family members pushed them into treatment, I would see them, watching a Hallmark commercial and just, crying and sort of looking at their hands and their tears, and what's this salty discharge coming out of me, like where is this coming from? And it was a common thing, and you can numb yourself with substances, but the emotions are still there.
Yep, it's very true. Another interesting thing, at least from an EMS provider standpoint, with the opiates, we have started to see a different demographic come up, particularly with heroin. The older groups with the chronic pain, who are now very limited in their prescription medications and their ability to get them, are now, I've seen a couple of cases, they are now dabbling in heroin because it's very accessible.
Well,
and, as you know, I mean, it's even crossed over into the public servant world too. When there's restricted access, and the last thing they want to do is get sick, and they're in a bad mindset because they have some mental health issues going on, which they may or may not be aware of. So they opt for going to the street substance and thinking that they can regulate it, and it doesn't work that way. Unfortunately, I did lose a personal friend to that same type of scenario not too long ago. So it's such a tough situation.
Well, that you sort of just described in a microcosm the opiate epidemic, as it is. So, first there was this very, very liberal policy of prescribing prescription medications, and a lot of abuse from doctors who were just basically making money as legal drug dealers. And then the needle has swung way back in the other direction because of the opiate epidemic. And in a sense, of course, it should to a point. And so then you have people who are physically and psychologically dependent on prescription pain pills. And suddenly, their provider has a very big change of heart about continuing them on those medications.
Yeah, and it puts the patient in a difficult spot, too, because it's, nobody wants to live in pain, but nobody wants to go through withdrawals or
absolutely
accidentally kill themselves either. So, it's tough.
Yeah, and if you're trying to supplement your prescription medications by purchasing pills on the street, you're going to find out that that's expensive real quick.
And you never know what you're going to get either, especially with all that carfentanil that's kicking around too.
Well, so what happens is people will try to buy, let's say they're taking perks and they're going through their script in a week, and they're trying to buy more perks on the street, and it's costing them hundreds and hundreds of dollars a week, and they can't afford it. So they and the pills become hard to get.
Yep.
And so then they switch over against their better judgment often to using heroin because it's much cheaper, and initially it's much cheaper and very effective and available, but also very deadly at times based on the what it's being cut with. and the cost savings, so to speak, dwindles pretty quickly once they start developing tolerance to that. So it's just a small reprieve from the cost and a much more dangerous road to go down.
I suppose it's, for us retired alcoholics, I suppose it's the difference between the top shelf and the plastic bottle.
A little bit, yeah. And so, it doesn't surprise me, though, that the drug of choice for many first responders is alcohol, because it is so much more socially acceptable.
And it's very much part of the culture, too.
And part of the culture, right? It's acceptable within the culture of, there's cop bars, right? And there's fireman bars. And
many, yes. And there are other extracurricular activities, but yes.
Yeah.
I probably sound a little self-righteous because I've definitely engaged in those over the years.
But you can do that in a group out in the open, where you can't do that with opiates. Like if you're drinking when you're off duty, you're not going to lose your job. But if someone finds out you're abusing perks or taking heroin, and you're EMS or a cop or a fireman, your job is in jeopardy.
Oh, very much so.
Yeah. So alcohol, and alcohol, of course, brings a whole host of its own challenges. In some ways, worse than opiates.
Yeah.
But I guess it doesn't surprise me that you see primarily alcohol as a quote unquote drug of choice amongst first responders.
And it doesn't help that a lot of organizations turn a blind eye to it too.
Right.
They write it off as, well, he just had too many to drink, or well, I guess he did have some. He hurt his back a couple months ago. Okay, let's have lunch.
Yeah.
It's very marginalized.
That's right.
It has been my experience with a couple of exceptions that most employers and organizations will go out of their way not to acknowledge that there's something going on.
Right.
And it doesn't do anybody any good. I'm hoping that culture shift is going to happen sooner than later, but it's a difficult area to do any sort of work in.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody ever wants liability, let alone to admit that there's a problem in a system that is supposed to be helping the public, among others. Very few want to go down that road. I can't say I don't understand it. Right. I certainly don't agree with it either.
Sure.
At some point, there has to be somebody who says, we need to take a serious look at the way that we're dealing with these people. The suicide rate, depending on what literature you're looking at, is between roughly 4 and 8 times the general population.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the problem with the literature is that almost every state has no mandated reporting for any of that.
Right.
There are a couple that do, and there's a few organizations that do track it. Firefighter Behavioral Health being the big one that tracks national numbers. In Connecticut, we have no reporting system for that. There's no requirements for any of that. So the data is just solidly not out there.
Right.
But it's no secret. There was a situation probably a year or so ago. A firefighter put on his Class A uniform and stood in front of a train.
Wow.
At what point are we going to have to start taking care of each other and realizing that something has to change?
You had mentioned to me before that there was an organization out there, and I guess it's in its early stages or in infancy, but they're thinking about potentially opening up a wellness center specifically for first responders with outpatient and intensive outpatient programs, things of that nature, right?
Yes, that would be Phyllis. The organization is Honor Wellness Center. It will be the region's only wellness center designed specifically around the first responder demographic. We have partnered up with her and her people. She's got some great people who are working with her. So we're hopeful to have that open in less than a year.
Great.
all the little things pending, because nothing ever goes smoothly when you get into the nonprofit world. But that's going to be a great resource.
Yeah, that's exciting to hear, and I think it will make it a lot easier for first responders to take that step.
Yeah, I mean, we're very different people, as you've probably figured out from the 5 minutes we talked beforehand. We do things very differently. We have our own interaction. We have our own, more often than not, jaded views on society and different topics. We typically don't interact the same way that the rest of the population does. We tend to be very specific, occasionally a little bit more difficult to deal with. So having these resources available that are created by people who understand and aren't going to be offended by, certain sets of languages or things that are discussed, I think is going to be very pivotal in getting more people to understand that there is help out there and that you are not alone. And with the people that we have been through, the biggest thing is that they feel so isolated from everybody else that is usually a big deterrent from them doing anything.
And why do you think first responders are particularly vulnerable to feeling isolation?
A lot of it has to do with the work. We go out there and we do things that normal people would not do. We repetitively expose ourselves to trauma and stressors that the general public would never even think about dealing with. And with that comes a certain set of pride. And with that pride comes sometimes the unwillingness to admit that there's a problem with self.
Right. That's right. And I do think that there is something about either the nature of the work and or the nature of the person who will do that work that makes it tough to be vulnerable and be the one asking for help and to admit that you might need help yourself when there's this culture of expected strength that is probably permeates most of those kind of settings. So, for instance, if you're a fireman, you're supposed to be able to handle, carrying a kid out in your arms and the kid's burned, the kid died, those kind of whole trauma. You're supposed to be able to handle trauma, I guess is what I'm saying.
That's what's expected of you, yes.
Right. But listen, we're all human, and there's certain things, I don't care what, we're not made of, steel.
Yeah, but we're very accustomed to hiding emotion.
Yeah. And I think it sets people up to fall into a pattern of using alcohol or developing depression and anxiety, and trying to continue with their relationships and trying to continue with that kind of work that's just going to stack up more trauma.
Absolutely.
And then there's some kind of substance there is there to help them get through it.
Yeah. One of the particular problems that we run against frequently is, given what we do for work, we are not unfamiliar with the shortfalls of some of the care systems around here. And when there's not a high level of confidence in something that you might be doing, such as going to get that care for your mental health or whatever it may be, when that confidence is gone, they're not going to approach that system. And it's not usually until they're forced to, when they have that event where they're suddenly thrust into that system. If we can catch people before that point and offer them alternatives, I think that's going to go a lot further.
You have to do outreach, though. You have to give people the opportunity to know it's okay to ask for that kind of help.
Yeah, I mean, we're a fairly small operation, but I have a pretty good network. Our first year in operation, we took care of 19 people, and they were returned to their lives, with the exception of a few who choose to retire, but that was situation dependent. And so far this year, we just took our 16th request a couple of days ago.
Okay.
And that's just in Eastern Connecticut. I'm not counting some of the more further outreaching things that we do. For those, we typically pair them up with a couple of other organizations or do what we can from a distance.
Well, you've set up a sort of continuum yourself through networking with particular providers that you've screened and that you know will that you can get access to, and that you will provide your peers that you're helping with the kind of support they need. Correct?
Yeah. Usually, you have 24 hours to get them to some sort of care before they change their mind.
Right.
So part of what we work with our provider network is that we can usually get somebody in to see them or to inpatient or wherever it need to be for anything acute or that needs to be addressed now. We can typically get them to see somebody within 24 hours or less.
And that is not typical for someone that doesn't have the kind of support that you're providing them.
It's pretty difficult.
Right. And you recently referred someone to my practice. Thank you very much. And
well, my pleasure. It's nice to get them to where they're going to get some definitive care and be able to take care of themselves again. Yeah.
Well, thank you. We were talking about priority access, and I was saying to you before the show that in my case, in terms of the Center for Compassionate Recovery, we've sort of set things up that in a way to acknowledge that anyone who's asking for help with opiate dependency is in an acute place, and they need help like immediately. We can't tell them we can start them on Suboxone in a week or 2 weeks or a month. We can't. That doesn't help.
Yeah.
So
that's part of it. That's a huge problem, particularly in this area. For this individual, I want to say between 3 or 4 of us, including a couple providers, contacted no less than 20 different programs and providers, and I think maybe 3 or 4 at tops got back. And your outfit was really good. I sent an email, and the next morning I had a solid response.
Great.
That was the first time that I've ever been able to get that in this field.
Well, I'm glad to know that we responded that way that quickly, but I'm not glad to know that I'm not glad to hear more reinforcement that there's still that level of difficulty accessing care for someone with an opiate addiction. And
yeah, it's really tough, and I sometimes, I don't know if chuckle is the right word to say, maybe a slight laugh out of aggravation when I see some things on the news. Certain people will be up there touting different programs, saying how much easier access is to care and being able to take care of themselves with an opiate problem. And I would love to have that opportunity to sit down with them and put on speakerphone and start calling some places and seeing what it's like to try and get in.
Yeah. There was, a couple of years ago, there was a Channel 8 news report about this. In fact, the woman that I was talking to you about that had the difficulty getting into detox, she was featured. And, she was travel on a bus to get to our office, and it was about a 12-hour bus trip each way. Mm-hmm. And she would spend, no, not each way, I'm sorry, it was about 6 hours each way. She'd spend 12 hours a day getting to our office because she couldn't find the help that she needed. She certainly couldn't find the kind of care that we were providing to her. And so Channel 8 did this story about how hard it was to access help for people with opiate addiction. And there's a SAMHSA website with all the providers that are listed, and it looked like there was just tons of providers in Connecticut, and they called and called and called, and that list was completely inaccurate, and it is hard to get access, and it's hard to get immediate access, and that's true of anyone who comes to you. They're in crisis, they need that, whether it's opiate or alcohol, whatever. We have to be able to give give someone a helping hand at the moment that they're willing to take it.
No, absolutely. Though we're not specifically, I should say, we're not set up as a crisis service per se.
Right.
It just turns out to be that way.
Well, people, by the time they come to you, they're in crisis.
Yeah.
Right?
Most of the time, yeah, probably 60% of the time that's the case.
Yeah. And with opiates, when people are asking for help, they're pretty much in crisis.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
Because of the physical component of the addiction, you know.
Yep. Same goes for just about any substance. Benzos are something we see pretty frequently too.
I would imagine benzos would definitely play a role for some people trying to cope with ongoing and building levels of trauma from work or.
Yeah, usually one of the first things that starts showing through is anxiety in different ways. We see it pretty frequently with social anxiety, being out of uniform and being in public places. That's usually one of the first things that people start to notice. And
can't transition from uniform to.
Yeah.
Yep,
they have difficulty with that and being in the crowds and having all those things going through your head of some of the potential things that could happen, and often it's that revolving thought of, particularly people with kids and families, is that revolving thought of what am I going to do to protect them since I'm in a public situation and I know how things can go down.
Right.
That's actually a pretty big thing for a lot of people.
Sure. If you're exposed to those kind of traumas day in and day out, and you realize that they're real and they can happen.
The law enforcement community, we see a lot of that in very specifically corrections. That's just not an easy job, and those guys have it pretty tough.
Right.
And I never really realized that until about a year or so ago. I started working with a couple of them.
Mm-hmm. Like correctional officers?
Yep, corrections, yep.
Yeah, I'm sure I haven't shared that with you, but I have worked in a federal prison for a few years in the beginning of my career. And one of the reasons I didn't stay there was I sort of looked around at the career officers, and I saw the way it was taking its toll on them.
Oh, yeah.
In fact,
they're in prison, too. Even though they get to go home, they're still in prison.
No, in fact, I had this aha moment where one of them, it was my first year, and the feds, when you work for the feds, you have a 20-year retirement gig, and so I was there for about a year, and an officer who was there for maybe 12 years asked me how much time I had in, and I said, well, a year. So I had 19 years left, and so he kind of looked at me and smiled and said, you poor son of a bitch, I've only got 8 years left. And it just sounded exactly like the inmates. Mm-hmm. And that was a moment I said, no, I'm not going to count down 20 years of my life, Ironically, I could have retired this year. So, but I don't regret it because that's some good years, 30 to 50, Yeah. And I didn't want to become, I didn't want that job to do what I think it could have done to my spirit over time. It's just even if that's something, I did have a couple of some potentially traumatic things occur, but nothing really bad. But just being in that environment itself, is sort of chronically depressing.
Yeah, those these professions, they do mess with your head, and the irony is that they don't typically tell you that when you get started with it. Particularly for EMS. I mean, thankfully it's starting to change a little bit where they're finally starting to incorporate some of these things either correctly or more comprehensively in some of the education than they were before. I know 15 years or so ago when I went through, I think taking care of yourself, wellness type of thing was like maybe a paragraph in the entire book.
Yeah.
Nobody ever talked about that type of thing.
Right.
It was, you take care of the others first and do what you got to do otherwise.
Right. I'll tell you that my experience working in that prison, I certainly don't think there was any kind of open discussions about, taking care of yourself emotionally or physically because of the nature of the job. And that would not have been a discussion people would have been having.
No, not at all. And that's pretty true across most of the public service spectrum. Even some of the outliers that we've dealt with over the years, animal control. I never really thought about some of the unique and specific stressors that they have there. I mean, dealing with the sick animals. We've had a few that have had some pretty life-changing attacks on them. Dealing with the owners and the people involved in that, and the stress situations involving weapons and all kinds of other things. And the worst thing in the world for them is going to have to try and seize an animal from somebody who's sitting behind the door with a handgun.
Yeah,
you don't really think about that with the quote local dog catcher, but
right.
Yeah, that's stressful.
I recently adopted a puppy from the local shelter, Branford Animal Shelter, and when you go in the back where the dogs are, it's just mostly pit bulls back there, and some dog that someone neglected, or a dog that caused some kind of problem that they had to be taken away from their owners, and it's kind of intimidating.
It's tough, yeah.
No,
nothing easy about that.
Right? No, I wouldn't think so. I really don't think there's any kind of, there's not a first responder or public service kind of job like that's easy.
Yeah. Dealing with the public it's more challenging than it sounds. Every spectrum of life you could possibly think of has their own challenges, and one of the unfortunate things that we have to live with is that there's always that potential that there's going to be somebody out there who wants to hurt you for no good reason, and that can be very scary. I've had my situations over the years, and it's not something that they ever really prepare you for. Probably a little more so now in the post 9/11 world, but it's still not something you can always plan for. You never know when something's going to turn bad on you, and sometimes it's just you and your partner, and that's it. You versus one person. I believe it was in New York somewhere, where the gentleman decided to shoot at the firemen when they showed up. He set his house on fire and sat there and waited with a weapon, and as they made entry to the house, he gunned them down. No particular motive that I remember ever reading. It's just one of those situations. It's scary. It's out there, and that always weighs on the back of your mind, especially when you hear that or see that through social media and everything else that's pushing that stuff out there. Because those are always the things you hear about, and those are the things that stick with you. And you don't always realize that right away, and it's not until it starts to ruminate inside your head that it starts to change your behavior. You become isolated. You begin dealing with issues with anxiety. You start seeing the nightmares come in. For me, it was always the nightmares. It was situations that I'd been to in the past years, but instead of the people that it actually was, it was the reflections of my family that was there.
Right.
And those can be pretty torturous to deal with.
So someone is a family member or a friend of a first responder. What are the kind of things that they should look for? Things like isolation, social anxiety, nightmares, increased use of drugs or alcohol.
Yep, increases in the bad habits or new bad habits. Problems with sleep is a big indicator. The isolation is a big one. Unfortunately, sometimes with the isolation, it gets written off, but it's definitely something that needs to be looked at. So if somebody is isolating, they've probably got something going on.
And so what would someone in that situation, in your opinion, do to try and approach the issue with that person?
It's been my experience that you cannot dance around it.
Okay.
You have to be very direct and be willing to, if you can't meet it head on, you need to find somebody who can, whether that's one of their coworkers, a boss, somebody that they really trust.
Right.
You have to be right to the point. Dancing around it with us is probably not going to be effective. I know it was not for me.
And so would that be something if someone was concerned about a loved one or friends, and they contacted your organization and said, hey, there's this cop or this that I'm married to, and I'm getting more worried. He's spending a little time alone, and he's been talking crazy stuff lately. And I hear him scream at night, and he won't talk to me. He's drinking more. And would that be something where you would be able to sort of step in and try and reach out? Have you guys done any kind of reach out work like that, or is it?
Yeah.
Have you had that opportunity?
Yep. We do it pretty frequently.
Oh, really?
I would say that's probably about close to half of the contacts that we get.
Interesting.
In a case like that, we would get as much information as we can, and from there we'd put it out to our provider network and see who would be closest to their location and who has the correct background and availability to deal with that. And from there, we would typically have the provider reach out to whoever contacted us, and they would initiate the contact that way. We can also send out one of our peers who would closely match that individual in that situation,
right,
and begin contact on that front too. Mm-hmm. So there's two ways that we can get out there.
Do you ever have providers who can go to the person?
Oh yeah, yep.
Really?
Most of them are available by phone, email, text, just about any time of the day, barring sleep, of course. But
yeah.
Even then, sometimes
Yeah.
I do have a few night owls that are in our network, so that is always an option.
Okay. Well, I think that's tremendous because, like you said, we've identified the fact that those individuals are not always willing on their own to seek help and to find a way in, especially with someone who they can relate to. Another peer.
And that's one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle that has been missing.
Right.
It's one of the chain links that I fell through myself, not once but twice, and many others. And we've been fortunate enough to catch a lot of people before they fell really hard, mm-hmm. and that's been very good to do. It's definitely been a great experience.
Well, I have to say it's really inspirational what you're doing. I know that you also work full time, right? And you have children. So, I mean, this is a lot that you're taking on. You must.
It takes a few hours, yeah.
Yeah. And I admire your passion, and I hope your organization gets the support it needs. Do you ever get the help from police or firemen or those kind of organizations to help do fundraisers for your organization?
Well, we're just starting to now. We've cultivated enough interest in what we're doing, and we've put enough feelers out there that there is a lot of interest in direct supporting. We've had a couple that have come on board, and it has been good to have for that. We do have some fundraiser things up there and some other opportunities that we're trying to expand on. Our biggest support group has been through Facebook, of all places. Mm-hmm. What we've gotten through there has been great. We have all of Facebook's nonprofit tools that we do use to our advantage. So, the donation work has been good. We've made some really great contacts that have been able to help us with things even outside of the treatment realm, whether that's when we post a request for help, giving somebody rides, helping with bedding, food assistance, a little bit of everything.
Right.
So that has been worked really well for us. I will say it's been pretty amazing to see even people that I know that I never would have had an indication that they had been through a situation like that in the years past will come forward all of a sudden and say, yep, I've been there. What can I do to help?
Wow, great. And I because of the nature of my work and the focus I have on the opiate epidemic, I guess I want to ask you, in your experience in your work, do you run into that a lot in terms of people needing help because they're in overdose and they're I guess that's it. The people who are you get emergency calls for that kind of thing often.
Very frequently, yes.
Yeah.
We see it a lot out in the eastern part of the state. It's almost always a daily event somewhere in the area. And sometimes it's not even the quote repeat customers. A lot of it's people passing in and out through town, the new first time user type of thing.
Yeah.
Or a situation where it's a bad batch or something really powerful is mixed in there.
Yep.
That has been more frequent too. One of the issues that we've seen in prior months is with what I mentioned before, the carfentanil. Probably sure you're pretty familiar with that at this point in your career. Whoever's been supplying it locally has bought pill presses and is pressing it into pills and passing it off as Vicodin.
Wow.
So now you have your regular pill users who are buying on the street, and they're getting something that is far more powerful than what they bargained for, and it doesn't always turn out very well for them.
Wow, yeah. I hadn't heard about having the carfentanil pressed in the pill form, but that's...
And they're sprinkling it in marijuana, too.
Uh-huh.
I had an unfortunate gentleman who went to have his evening toke and got more than he bargained for, and he was very surprised when I woke him up with the Narcan. He had no idea what he had gotten into.
Wow.
So thankfully that was the end of his escapade in drug use. I have not seen him since. So,
and I understand it's taking quite a few hits with the Narcan to get people around sometimes.
Especially the synthetics.
Yeah.
Yes. It also depends on the type of ingestion too. But yeah, it's even to the point where the DPH, the regulatory agency that deals with us, has doubled the dose that we can give on the first shot now.
Wow.
Fentanyl is 100 times more powerful than morphine, and the carfentanil is 1,000 times more powerful than morphine on the multiple scale. So it takes more to reverse those receptor sites than anything else.
That's right. And I've seen, I haven't tracked this in any way officially, but I've noticed that clients who come into my practice who tell me that they did X amount of heroin, 1 bundle a day or 2 bundles a day, where previously we would have been able to stabilize them on 8 milligrams of Suboxone. Now it's taking 16 milligrams because their bundle and a half that they're saying that they use a day is got a lot of fentanyl in it. And so it's a lot more potent than a bundle and a half of heroin 5 years ago.
Yeah, very much.
And so I just see a rise in the initial dose that we have to utilize to get people to what we call their saturation point, or sort of equilibrium, in terms of taking their withdrawal symptoms away and relieving them of chronic cravings by getting those opiate receptors calmed down. And it just takes more Suboxone initially to do that because of how the potency of what people are using out there.
Yeah, there was some wacky stuff out there a couple of months ago. They were a supplier was mixing in Cardizem, which is a very potent cardiac drug, so calcium channel blocker. They were mixing in Cardizem in with the heroin, with the thought of that it would make the high better. And we're starting to see some of our frequent opiate users with strange heart rates. Their heart rate would be slow, and they would have other abnormalities with that. And it wasn't until I think it was either the state lab or the DEA lab came back, and they when they analyzed some of the samples that were seized, they figured out that they were cutting it with cardiac drugs.
Wow,
pretty wild. I never would have thought about that. I'm not sure if it worked, but I know that the outcome wasn't always so great. But
yeah, one thing I will say, my clients, a lot of them I've noticed are one of the motivators that they use to not relapse on heroin in particular is they're really genuinely scared. They
don't blame them.
And they should be. but they get it that any bag of heroin could be the last thing that they do.
It reminds me of the Prohibition era and the moonshine. I'm either going to get drunk or I'm going to go blind.
Right.
Should I have that drink?
Yeah. And some of my clients have thought that if when they were out there running, that if I snort it instead of shoot it, I'll be fine. And that's not always
not
the
so
case
much.
either. Yeah. You snort some fentanyl, and you can overdose that way too.
Yeah, well, occasionally we see some drug mix-ups. We have a few dealers that apparently are not very business savvy. I had some unfortunate soul who, of all things, it was his 60th birthday. He went out, partying on the town with his friends, and typical scenario. The shady guy in the bathroom says, "Hey, I'll sell you an 8-ball of coke."
Yeah.
So he buys what he thinks is cocaine and blows a bag of heroin.
Yeah.
And then only to be woken up shortly after with my Narcan. He was very surprised.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the outcome was for the guy who bought the cocaine, thinking it was the heroin, but I imagine it probably wasn't what he had bargained for.
No, you're not supposed to fall asleep, pass out when you do cocaine.
Yeah, that tends to be a problem.
Oh. I see we're about out of time. I just want to really thank you very much for joining me today, and I hope to have you back on the show another time. And I'm really interested in hopefully that wellness center will develop, and we'll talk offline. Anything I can do to support your efforts, my organization or myself personally, I'll be happy to do that.
Well,
okay.
Great to be here, and I look forward to coming back. Thanks for having me.
All right, thank you so much, and good night to everyone out there. And I love you, Thea, and I love you, Connor, and I love you, Sullivan. Good night.
PPRNradio.net. Featured guest DJs. Music news. The hottest DJs from around the world.